Hello to DIHL Consults SQL tutorials for beginners, audit professionals, and data analysts. In the previous videos, we've shown or demonstrated how data analytics can be done using SQL on a database table. And here we are going to demonstrate more relevant analytics you can perform on a database table using SQL, in this case Oracle SQL. So looking at a table named transaction, you can select transaction count by status. That is, you want to know the number of transactions by status. So select transaction status, count all from transaction, group by transaction status. So this will count the number of transactions for each transaction status in the transaction table, grouped by the transaction status column. The result is a summary of transaction counts categorized by their status. We can also look at the total amount by transaction status. So here you say select transaction status, sum transaction amount from transaction, grouped by transaction status. So the column selected here are based on the column in that particular table, in this case the transaction table. So the scripts calculate the total transaction amount for each transaction status in the transaction table, grouped by the transaction status column. The result is a summary of the total transaction amount categorized by their status. And then you can also do transaction count by customer. So the table has customer ID. So we say select customer ID, count all from transaction, and then group by customer ID. So this will count the number of transactions for each customer rather in the transaction table, grouped by the customer ID. The result is a summary of the transaction counts for each customer. You can do a total amount by customer. That is, for each customer you want to see the total amount of transactions that have been done by them. So select customer ID, sum transaction amount from transaction, grouped by customer ID. So this will calculate the total transaction amount for each customer in the transaction table, grouped by customer ID. So the result is a summary of the total transaction amount for each customer. Then another analytics that can be done is to look at top 10 largest transactions. So in the transaction table, transactions of various status or statuses were present there. So we have success transaction, failed transaction, or pending transaction. So in this case, we are saying select all from transaction, where transaction status equals success, ordered by transaction amounts, DESC first 10 rows only. So the script retrieved the top 10 transactions with a status of success from the transaction table, ordered by the transaction amount in descending order. The result is a list of the 10 highest transaction amounts for successful transactions. Then we can also look at the top 10 customer by total transaction amount. So we say select customer ID, sum transaction amounts from transaction, where transaction status equals success, then group by customer ID, order by sum transaction amounts, DSA first 10 rows only. So this will retrieve the top 10 customer by total transaction amount for successful transactions from the transaction table, grouped by customer ID, and ordered by the transaction amount in descending order. The result is a list of the 10 customers with the highest total transaction amount for successful transaction. So then we can also do transaction over a certain amount. For in this case, transaction above 500 with the relevant currency in the table. So we say select all from transaction, where transaction amount greater than 500 and transaction status equals success. So this will retrieve all the transactions from the transaction table where the transaction amount is greater than 500 and the transaction status is success. The result is a list of successful transactions with amount over 500. We can also select transaction within a specified date range. For instance, within a year, you want to select transaction for a 6-month period. So select all from transaction, where transaction dates between 1st of January 2024 and 31st of October 2024, and transaction status equals success, order by transaction date. So this will retrieve all successful transactions from the transaction table that occur between January 1st, 2024 and October 31st, 2024, ordered by the transaction date. The result is a list of successful transactions within that date range, sorted chronologically. So let's demonstrate this in Oracle SQL Developer Platform. So to start, the first thing to do is to select all from the table, in this case the transaction table. So this will display the data in the table. You can see the overview of the data in the table, the transaction date, transaction ID, customer ID, currencies, transaction amount, transaction remarks, processor ID, processor name, transaction status. So as stated earlier, if we are to do transaction count by status, so we'll say select transaction status, which is a column in the database table, in this case transaction table, put a comma, then count all. The all there is the star, count all from transaction, then group by transaction status, a column selected in our script, transaction status. So because there's an existing script on the platform, in this case select all from transaction, so I will highlight this before I click the execute button. So we can see here the output. So in terms of transaction status, we have pending, failed, and success. And in terms of the number of transactions that are pending, we see the record. Failed transaction, we see the record. And then success transaction, we see the records. So let's take this out so that it will be easier for us to execute our script. So next is to, for instance, check transaction status or total amount by transaction status. Total amount by transaction status. So in this case, sum transaction amount if I execute this, we'll see pending, failed, and success, and the total the total amount for each of the transaction status. So let's do transaction count by customer. Transaction by count by customer. So I go back to check our table, in this case transaction. So select all from transaction, and we can see from the output there's a column which is customer ID. So checking transaction count by customer, transaction count by customer. The double dash I put before transaction count by customer will invalidate that phrase or statement. It will not be executable. So I can do same for select all from transaction to invalidate it, and then you can now select customer underscore ID, which is a column in the transaction table, then count all. So when you say all, our all is specified with the star sign as shown. From transaction, then we group by what? By the customer ID as the only column selected against the aggregate, in this case the count all. So I can execute this directly without highlighting it, because the other values in the platform has been invalidated. So if I click on this, so we can see the output, a customer and transaction. So in this case, we can see there's no condition to specify transaction status. So for instance, customer CN 001037 had 10 transactions. So this will definitely include, or possibly include, success transaction, failed transaction, and pending transaction. So just to demonstrate where we can put condition, if I highlight this and run it, we can see, if I go through the output, we can see the transaction status column here. So I put a condition, and condition will start with where transaction status equals success, as specified in our record, success. And then if I execute this, you can see for the same customer CN 001037 that was 10 in the first script, it has now become 3. That shows for that customer successful transaction is 3. So we can do total amount by customer. So I'll just modify the script and do sum transaction amount transaction. Let's invalidate the condition where transaction status is success, and then I can run this. We can see for all transaction, regardless of the status, we have this total amount. So if I remove the double dash here and execute this again, you can see the difference. So this is just looking at successful transaction amount for each customer in terms of successful transaction. So let's look at top 10 largest transaction top 10 largest transaction for successful transaction. So it says select all, but what SQL will understand, instead of putting all, is star. So select all from transaction where transaction status equals success. I have to specify the way the value is in the table, then order by transaction amount, descending order, that's DSC. You can see there's a mistake here, I have to bring that back. DSC, then fetch with the command fetch first 10 rows only. So if I execute this, the script will retrieve the top 10 transactions with a status of success from the transaction table, ordered by the transaction amount in descending order. And as we can see, the result is a list of the 10 highest transaction amount for successful transaction. You can see the output is 10, and that is based on this command fetch first 10 rows only. Okay, so let's do 10 customers, top 10 customer by total amount. So I'll just modify this script to say customer ID, comma, so click on the tab button. I take that back. If I click on the tab button 2 times, that will move the cursor forward. Twice the sum transaction amount transaction where transaction status is success, and because I'm doing a sum of transaction amount in this case, where I also have a column selected, so I have to group by the column, group by customer ID, and order by sum transaction, order by sum transaction amount, DFC fetch first 10 rows only. So if I execute this will retrieve the top 10 customer by total transaction amount for successful transaction from the table, in this case transaction table, group by the customer ID and order by the transaction amount in descending order. So the result is a list of the top of the 10 customer with the highest total transaction amount for successful transaction. So let's do transaction over a certain amount. Transaction over a certain amount. So if I do select all from, let me do it this way, select all from transaction where transaction amount equals, oh no, in this case greater than 500, and transaction status equals success. Execute this, so this will retrieve all transactions from the transaction table where the transaction amount is greater than, so there must be something. Let's check the script. Select all from transaction where transaction amount greater than 500 and transaction status. Let me see. And transaction status. So yes, while writing your script, you can encounter windows like this. So it's a transaction amount that I can see. So is this column, the name here, the column name. There's a typo error there. Transaction amounts. So let's execute that again. So that will retrieve a transaction from the transaction table where the transaction amount is greater than 500 and the transaction status is success. So finally, for this session, let's see transaction within a specific date range. So you might have a request that you are required to extract transaction process or consummated within a period or a certain period. So in this case, let's look at transaction from 1st of January 2024 to 31st of October 2024. That is transaction between 1st of January 2024 and 31st of October 2024. So I'll modify this, select all from transaction where transaction dates. So I change this column, transaction dates between, let's see, 01 Jan 2024 and 31st October 2024, and transaction status equals success. Then if I execute this, it will run. Well, I want to order by the transaction date. So without specifying the order, it will automatically sort by dates in ascending order. So if I execute this, so this will return all successful transactions from the transaction table that occur between January 1, 2024 and October 31, 2024. Order by the transaction date column. So okay, I believe you've enjoyed this session so far and you are getting something. If you'd need anything, any clarification, you can drop comments in the comment section and then that will be attended to. Thank you.